Okay, I just really quickly wanted to show you how I plan a lesson from start to finish. Whoops. So I start with my pre-K guidelines, and I start with this year at a glance, and I look at what Scholastic says we are to teach the children, which guidelines we are to cover in the lessons. I then list them here, and this is my guideline goal planning sheet that I created with all of the resources that I need in order to create a lesson. And so I list the Texas Pre-K guidelines from this year at a glance, and I identify any gaps, whether there's a lesson that's not touching the guideline, or there's just, or one of the guidelines that isn't in a lesson. So I identify those gaps. And then once I identify those gaps, I put them into week 1, week 2, week 3, or week 4. And I fill in those gaps using the developmental progression and my knowledge of my students and my knowledge of the pre-K guidelines. So once I filled in those gaps and I put them here under my designated guideline, now the dark red is whole group, the light red is small group. And these are both literacy, and then green is math, dark green is whole group math, and then light green is small group. And so I do fill in those gaps for Texas Pre-K guidelines, and then I get to do the fun part of coming up with an activity. So I start with Scholastic and use that as an inspiration, but then I find ways to make it more engaging and more playful and more specific to my students. And so then I come up with ways, I come up with the initial lesson design. What do I plan to do? Next, while I'm doing that, I'm also listing any resources or materials that I will need for that lesson outside of the curriculum that's there for me. Next, what I do is I create really engaging and really creative questions that follow the class design or the class model of quality feedback, concept development, and language modeling. And these questions are all designed to increase rigor and just promote those higher order thinking their responses from my students, and just promote engagement and conversation with my particular students. Now I do this for both whole group and small group, but small group's not listed on here because it is on my learning objectives, which are in my drive. So once I've come up with all these questions, next thing I do on this sheet is I tier my students. And you can see my groupings in my groupings folder. But I find ways to challenge my students or scaffold up, and then meet the needs of my students by scaffolding down. And so I always have that prepared in the materials that I need to do that, so that I'm meeting the needs of every single one of my students in my classroom. So once I filled all that out for week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4, I then come up to my materials list. I've created this sheet so that I am certain that I have all of the materials I need prepared and ready on the day that I need to teach that lesson. And so for some of those things, I need to grab them at home. It's just a quick grab. Some of them I need to request from the center, some things I need to make, and some things I need to purchase. And so anything that I need to request, make, or purchase, I put a date on there. So like I said, it is prepared and ready to go on the day of the lesson. So once I have all that information, I then go into my Canva, where I create my lesson plan that is designed to, I take this and I lay it out in a way that anyone can teach from, inclusive of my co-teacher. So it's easy to read and easy to understand here. And so I lay out all that information, and I put in my grading circle, where I do unite, disengage, connect, commit, which is really important for building those relationships. And then I add my morning message, and I look at what letters we're going to focus on. I focus on 2 to 3 letters a week, what phonological awareness skill we're going to work on for that day, and then a closing sentence to kind of extend that learning from that morning message, and again, promote that higher order thinking. The last thing I do on my lesson plan is I plan my exit tickets. Again, I go back to my guidelines and I look at, what am I teaching in whole group and small group in both literacy and then in math. And I plan for my literacy circle to be aligned to that guideline and made in a playful way so that my kids are really engaged. I then use that information to sort my students based on children who can synthesize information, who can analyze some information, and who can produce information. And again, I scaffold accordingly when I'm giving those exit tickets. And so you can see my exit tickets here. So that's pretty much it for creating it. I then print it out every single day. I review the information before I teach it. I highlight, make modifications and adjustments based on where my students